Hi, just to kind of introduce myself, I'm Edward Stewart, doing a PhD at the moment at the University of Glasgow, looking at kind of shieling practice, mainly across Scotland, but in particular as a main case study, Glencoe, and thinking about kind of how the uplands are being used, thinking about how we're representing these landscapes when we're doing archaeological work within them, and trying to think a little bit more critically about the power that those narratives that we create about the Highland landscape are actually being used in the contemporary world as well. So in light of things like kind of rewilding and some of these kind of big processes that are kind of sweeping across the country at the moment, the rise of the Green Lairds and all these sorts of things you'll maybe seen in the papers, and thinking about kind of how those debates are being informed very much by our kind of archaeological narratives about these landscapes and how they in turn have been kind of influenced by these kind of various schools of landscape thinking. So that's some of the kind of background to the research. But what I'm going to talk about today, hopefully, is a bit more the kind of practical archaeology of what I've been doing for the last 2.5 years now, which is a kind of in-depth study of the kind of uplands of Glencoe, in particular this kind of tributary valley, Gleann Leac-na-Muidhe, which runs just to the south of that. But I'll show you that all hopefully coming up. So just to kind of have a quick think then about how are these landscapes normally represented before we dive into the archaeology. So if you think of the kind of main schools of thinking about the Highland landscape, then we come from this kind of pre-romantic sort of style, which is really kind of it's being brought about by these kind of outsiders entering into the Highland landscape and normally having to traverse through it, and the kind of sheer misery that they experience in that seems to be reflected quite nicely in their kind of descriptions of it. So you get the likes of Edmund Burke, who's writing in the 1700s, being described often as kind of waspishly Anglo-centric. But he is this sort of government road building projects engineer sent up to work out of Inverness, and he really seems to detest the Highland landscape. He describes it as huge naked rocks being just above the heath produce the disagreeable appearance of a scabbed head, which is quite a visceral way of describing what less than a generation later Sir Walter Scott's calling each purple peak, each flinty spire is bathed in floods of living fire. So you're getting quite a kind of dramatic reversal in how this landscape's being understood during this period. And Glencoe is one of these kind of pivotal landscapes in this romantic movement that people are visiting as part of these domestic tours. And it's really becoming kind of, and continues to be to this day, kind of one of the archetypal Highland landscapes that people really do kind of conceptualise when they think of a Highland landscape. But with that kind of romantic notion, and those kind of notions of romanticism stick with us, I think, quite strongly even today. If you think about kind of how Visit Scotland adverts are framed or such, it's using some of the same kind of aesthetic principles that you would see in those kind of romantic style depictions in the sublime nation. So you kind of see these kind of the human activities quite often kind of downplayed and made to be smaller in order to give scale to the kind of natural and the kind of overlying and quite violent sometimes power of that. And kind of moving on from that, you kind of get the kind of Scottish or the Gaelic revival. And you've got this kind of idea of kind of the personification of landscape and of mountains and of places, and them being kind of embroiled in themes of memory and thought and place, and people kind of quite nicely summed up sometimes in that kind of term ducus. But just to kind of highlight that then. And then finally, you get what's probably the kind of among the kind of dominating ones nowadays, and quite often the one kind of touted by those in the kind of rewilding and ecological side of things, that they kind of view it as Fraser Darling put it, as a wet desert, something that's kind of been scarred and ruined by sheep and deer. And so just to kind of fly over then the kind of main narratives, and these have kind of informed how people have interpreted upland archaeology since then. So if we're thinking about kind of narratives in archaeology, in particular, those sorts of ideas that upland places, upland settlement sites and such were only really occupied as a last resort when all the kind of lowland glen spaces had been filled up. And this idea that the Highlands themselves are inherently somehow unproductive places to be, that in kind of prehistoric times and such, settlement of these places only happened, again, after all the kind of available nice flat lowland areas had been occupied. And obviously the archaeological record doesn't actually really show that. So it's just worth thinking about how some of these kind of wider societal kind of trends and how we understand landscape are kind of impacting, actually, even to this day, people's interpretations of these landscapes archaeologically. So just to think about the shieling then, and you are all far more familiar with it than I think I could ever hope to be. But thinking about the shieling then and its role in these kind of narratives. So we've got this kind of rough structure, turf, dry stone, thatch, as described by various kind of visitors in the 17th, 18th century. We've got kind of brushwood doors, heather beds, beaten earth floors. And even in the kind of the styling of these, if you think back to kind of Pennant's tour of Jura, the kind of classic image of the Shielings, They're very much made to echo the styles of what's being encountered by people at the same time as these trips are going on in places like the kind of American West. And there's this real effort at the time when these are starting to first be studied to kind of create a parallel between the kind of wilderness of the Scottish Highlands and the wilderness of the West at this point. And quite often you see in these narratives that the kind of unimproved nature of Highland agriculture at this time period is being used to kind of represent the uncivilized nature of the people of the Highlands as well. And so there's this kind of part of this notion as well that's quite kind of sinisterly tied up to these notions of kind of the noble savage and such. So it's just being aware of where some of the earlier kind of sources that relate to Shieling landscapes and such are coming from. It's worth kind of trying to problematise them a little bit. As I'm sure anyone who's had to go at digging Shielings will know, they're quite notoriously archaeologically sterile. The chances of finding finds from them is fairly slim. And of the various excavated examples, not many have actually pulled up much by way of those nice kind of datable finds that one would hope for when they're finding something. And so actually the study of Shielings too has been quite a marginal activity for quite a long time. So if we think about those kind of earliest studiers of the Highland landscape archaeologically, they're actually primarily geographers, so the like of kind of Horace Fairhurst, founder of obviously archaeology at Glasgow, but then McSween, who carries out the excavations on Skye as well, one of the early examples, even up to kind of Miller. These are all geographers actually by training. And so even that those kind of earliest excavations are being carried out more from a kind of historical geography perspective than they are actually from archaeology, which might contribute somewhat to kind of the sometimes kind of economically deterministic models that kind of come out of some of those as well. So to bring us then back into the kind of archaeology more proper then, thinking about Glencoe and the uplands of Glencoe, it's actually, just by the very nature of the geography and the geology, a very steep-sided glen, and so the grazings available within Glencoe itself are actually quite limited. Most of the grazing exists kind of on the fringes of Rannoch Moor, obviously an extensive area of grazings, which is shared by quite a lot of the kind of communities that fringe it by the sounds of things. There's also areas kind of around the hunting forest of Buckle, or Bucklet of Moor, and that kind of area around there. But they are obviously being kind of managed at various points as a hunting forest, and it seems that dates back to at least kind of the medieval period as well. So there's quite an early provenance of this being designated as an area of hunting forest. Obviously, there will be kind of activities going on in there, so things like charcoal burning and such could be well expected within a hunting forest, but it's far harder to evidence within these kind of upland landscapes where that kind of historic forestry just hasn't survived. So to kind of, on the other side of the pass of Glencoe, and I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with Glencoe, but this is the townships that would have existed as of kind of Roy's map. And so they provide us with a little bit of a kind of snapshot of what it might have looked like in Glencoe at this time. So we have the two kind of settlements of Invercoe and Carnoch, and then Ballyhullish down on the kind of coast there by Lochleven. And then coming in, we've got Achnacon and Antor, and then Strone and Achtreaton, which you might have seen the National Trust for Scotland have been excavating for a couple of seasons now. And then we also have records in this sort of tributary glen, which runs south from Achnacon, Gleann Leac-na-Muidhe. And supposedly there's a settlement here, at least in the 1600s. And there's some quite interesting kind of aspects that we can unpick about it as well, as an upland settlement compared to the kind of valley floor settlements. So what do we have from the records actually? We know that the settlement of Carnoch has its grazings on Rannoch, so the very furthest west of the settlements has its grazings on the very furthest east of the grazing lands, which is quite interesting in terms of thinking about who has rights to which ground. And it seems likely that probably all of the Glencoe townships had rights to various patches of grazing on Rannoch as well as having rights within the glen itself. This kind of idea of the home shieling and the kind of far away shieling is quite a common one across most of kind of Perthshire, and it came across very much from the work of the Ben Lawers Landscape Research Project as well, which I'm sure again many of you will be familiar with. Of the other kind of shieling and upland related sources that we actually get, there are very few for Glencoe really. And so the next thing that we really have is that Alexander MacDonald, the 11th chief of the MacDonalds, is actually killed at his summer sheilings as part of a dispute between the Stewarts of Appin with Alban and Ardshiel and the MacDonalds of Glencoe over some slightly dubious murders that go on while people are passing through Glencoe at the time. So we know then that the chief men of Glencoe are actually visiting their sheilings during this period. And it seems very likely that that shieling ground that they're visiting is the one in Gleann Leac-na-Muidhe, based off the kind of sources and the description of how these various groups fell upon the MacDonalds. And kind of finally then we get this source that Alexander McKeon MacDonald, so that's the 12th chief of the MacDonalds who dies in the Glencoe massacre. He also has a summer house up the glen at Gleann Leac-na-Muidhe as well. So we potentially have this kind of chiefly upland settlement that's being reoccupied repeatedly over potentially quite a period of time. And it seems to fall out of use at this point. So after McKeon, it doesn't appear in Roy's map, so it's not present during the kind of period of the later Jacobite risings, which is quite interesting to think about, and that it presumably then gets abandoned with the fall of that chief. Because Roy, obviously doing a very good job of mapping anywhere where he's remotely suspicious of kind of Jacobite sympathies, does a very good job of mapping Glencoe and the whole, and particularly its townships. And so it would be quite suspicious if he hadn't marked this township as well, if it had still been in use as well. He even goes as far as to mark some of the droving roads that run over this pass as well. So it's quite interesting that there's this kind of abandonment phase almost, perhaps, of some of the settlement activity within this upland glen during that period. So just to look into that glen then, Gleann Leac-na-Muidhe, and to explore some of its archaeology in more detail. So this is the results from our recent survey work. You can see there's the kind of modern sheep farm, the white dot in the centre of the glen there, which is roughly, we think, on the kind of footsteps of the previous pre-improvement kind of settlement. There are two kind of shielings down at the very bottom of the glen, so in the north of this image, which seem to kind of demark the limit between one farm or settlement at Strone and the ground that seems to be associated with Achnacawn and Gleann Leac-na-Muidhe, and the various kind of settlements there. So there's something quite interesting already coming out with this use of shielings to demark boundary grounds and boundary areas, and hopefully kind of come back and circle back to that as we go through this. But there's quite a range of activities going on within this upland actually, and I'll explore them a bit more in a few seconds. But just to think of these landscapes then, that kind of idea that we very much was propagated for a long time with the shielings as this kind of empty and wild place, a freeing place where they could sort of, the idea of the lone milkmaid that's so often kind of repeated actually doesn't really bear up archaeologically, because these are very busy landscapes with a whole range of kind of resources being harvested at various points in the year, different seasonalities, interrelations and kind of related practices going on, and particularly kind of dominated by people moving through that landscape quite regularly, be it the kind of community of herders, primarily kind of female dairy maids and such, but also kind of the menfolk going up to do peat cutting and such during this season as well, and returning with those peats to various kind of drying stances as well. So we have a quite busy landscape actually, archaeologically. So just to kind of highlight that in a little bit more detail then, we've got this sort of settlement site on the kind of eastern side of the river, or the burn, the Leac-na-Muidhe. And the place name itself, Leac-na-Muidhe, should kind of translate to Gleann Leac-na-Muidhe, the glen of the rock of the milk churn. And it's debatable whether that relates to the kind of practice of the shielings up here, or whether it relates to the fact that the river kind of flows through this kind of quite smooth limestone, and it creates these kind of cauldron-like pools. So either or is a reasonable interpretation. But we actually have quite a nice variety of activities going on here. So we've got kind of a lower shieling group at group 3 and group 2. There's a kind of high shieling group of sort of smaller structures up at group 1. There's a cluster of kind of charcoal burning platforms in between these. And then there's a series of peat cutting banks and probable kind of peat cutters' bothies as well up on the very high ground, which sort of forms the boundary between the lands of MacDonald of Glencoe and Glencreran, which is one of his kind of tacksman's lands. And then down into Glencreran, which is the Stewarts of Appin, and particularly James of the Glen is associated with that glen. So we've got kind of two kind of rivaling chiefly power systems, the slightly more powerful Stewarts of Appin on one side, and the MacDonalds of Glencoe, the slightly smaller neighbour, on the other side. So just bear this in mind, this idea of kind of the use of these kind of practices and processes, and people being within this landscape as a way of kind of reaffirming boundaries between landholdings as well, potentially, during this kind of period of the early modern. And this is just to show you there's these kind of network of tracks as well that seem to connect these places. And they're being kind of cut into the hillside and then reinforced on the other side as well. So there is kind of movement between this place. This is quite a busy landscape. People are moving between Glencue and Glencoe using these kind of tracks. And so again, this kind of idea of reaffirming the boundaries between these places seems to perhaps be quite important to how we understand how this glen is actually being used and managed. So this is those kind of upper Shieling clusters there. So in the bottom kind of left-hand side, you've got there's a kind of big peach stance. There's a kind of bothy type structure that's maybe being used by those kind of travelling up, because it's quite a considerable distance up to here in order to cut those peats. And then we have two quite convincing peat cutting banks as well on that hillside. And so we've got this kind of area where at various kind of points in the year, people are travelling up to cut the peats, to stack the peats, and then to cart the peats back down the hill again. And there are a couple of kind of way station peat stances along the hillside that seem to suggest that this is being done in kind of stages, which makes quite a lot of sense if you've ever had to carry survey equipment up that hill. I can understand why you would want your peat stances, you take your peats down in steps. And this is kind of one of the bases of one of those kind of peat cutting bothies, or what we interpret as that. It doesn't look particularly convincing in the photograph, I must say, in retrospect, but there is a quite decided kind of structural base around there. It's a sort of sub-rectangular structure sitting on a sort of small sort of mound, so probably turf built, and they've kind of used, that's created that kind of mounding by cutting the turfs around it. And then on the right-hand side there, we've got the peat bank as well, which is this kind of big rectangular cut out of the hillside, quite convincingly human-made. Kind of moving slightly down the hill then, so we've got, on the left-hand side, we've got the kind of upper cluster of Shielings. And these are quite small by way of kind of as Shielings go, so they're sometimes what might be kind of considered to be a kind of shelter hut or a storage hut. They're approximately 1.5 meters internally across, all circular on sort of small mounds. And there's about 5 of them up there. As well, along with a kind of platform feature as well. So potentially you've got some kind of cutting of fodder going on or some such practice as well. Actually, between them and the kind of main Shieling clusters, there's also this possible whisky still site, which is kind of nestled into a rock face, curved round with a little stream running down the side of it. So pretty convincing. And not really in an area where there's any particular kind of grazing value. It's quite a steep spot, so really you're not going to get cows up or down it very easily. The biggest cluster of Shielings though in this glen is actually the one that sits in that kind of V of the two burns there in the centre of the image. And there's this rather large cluster of quite big Shielings. Most of them are kind of big dry stone structures. Some of them are circular, some of them are rectangular. And they kind of sit across a series of kind of paleo channel banks down along this kind of river burn side. And there's some quite interesting things going on as well. We've got a kind of enclosure structure, which is probably kind of where one of those features that Albert Bill kind of identified as being related to the kind of management of lost stock. So cows that have kind of strayed from one group's grazing to another are being kind of managed by these pens, which are quite often reported as being right next to rivers as well, to provide them with a kind of water supply. So this is quite kind of classic for how Shieling landscapes are being managed across this kind of region. So this is just some pictures then of those upper Shielings. So on the bottom, the top left-hand side, we have those kind of upper Shielings, and you can see them marked quite nicely by the kind of spots of that kind of limeish green colour, dark lime green, against the otherwise kind of beigeish hillside. So there's one about here, just where you can see me surveying to the right of it. There's one here, and there's one here as well. So we've got this quite nice cluster, and there's actually one built against this big rock here as well. So there's quite a nice cluster of them going on. They're these kind of roundish structures again, kind of quite mounded. And down in the valley, quite conveniently actually, the Shielings are all marked by these dark green clusters of reeds. So you can see them again quite clearly in this image in the bottom right-hand side as well. And they're substantially larger, so the ones in this kind of cluster are between 4 to 6 metres across, varying between the rectangular and the circular ones. But they all seem to be very similar in construction. So this kind of low dry stone kind of foundation piece or lower wall, which has then been topped by a kind of turf upper wall and roof as well. Which seems to be the classic both for the kind of turf houses and kind of byre houses in the main glen and for the Shielings up here as well. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples that we've excavated in a few slides. So this is the other Shieling cluster that we have. It's directly opposite that kind of settlement site. And it represents some of the largest Shielings we actually have in the glen. So we've got Shielings here that are, there's a kind of variety of ones from ones that kind of measure similar diameters to those at the kind of lower Shieling group at the other side. But we've also got some that reach up to kind of 9, 10, 11 metres along. So really quite substantial structures in comparison to what might be those around them. And so there's questions about what is the different function of these features. If we've got the very small kind of storage huts or shelters up in the upland, and then in the same kind of areas down in the kind of lower Shieling grounds, which is presumably where we've got the kind of prime cattle, the milking cattle, we have these big structures, and then we have these smaller kind of tough structures as well. And they seem to be potentially kind of contemporary as well, as far as we can tell from excavations so far, although we're kind of waiting on radiocarbon date results that would hopefully prove that a little bit better. So what do we have down there as well? These are some of the structures that we've excavated so far. So there was a kind of rectangular turf-built shieling that you can see on the left-hand side there. It had this rather nice circular stone in the centre of it, underneath which were two successive hearth phases. So this has been interpreted as a smearing stone, which kind of ties into some of the kind of oral history traditions around kind of religious practices at this time, and the idea as well of kind of smearing your fire and saying kind of chants or prayers to the kind of health of the family and the herd while doing that act. And that essentially is reducing the risk of your shieling burning down while you're inside it, while you sleep. But it's also kind of keeping that fire burning as embers overnight as well. So it's really nice to actually be able to kind of archaeologically evidence that practice potentially. And it's quite nice as well, the kind of intentionality that someone laid this kind of slab back over the hearth the last time before they abandoned the structure, whether they knew they were going to abandon it or not. So there's something quite nice in that, I think, as well, thinking about kind of how these landscapes have been used over time. The other structure, which you can see in the plan in the kind of centre, top centre of the image there, and which is photographed a piece of kind of timber that survived from that on the right-hand side. This was a kind of smaller structure. It's built against a big kind of natural outcrop of bedrock. And it seems to be a kind of orthostatic, so it's these kind of boulders that have been levered up on end, and then a turf upper part has been constructed over that, probably with a kind of timber cruck frame based off. We didn't seem to come across any coastals, not to say that there don't exist any, because we only have sectioned the structure. But potentially it's had a kind of cruck frame roof, which would be quite classic again, and bears to some of the kind of reconstruction work that's been done, kind of reproducing shielings and trying to understand how they were made. We also, during this season, so this was 2022, we excavated this platform as well, which seems to be what we think at least is a kind of fodder gathering platform. So we have, as well as people grazing their cattle up here, they're also gathering grasses to make winter fodder, essentially. And we have a few of these kind of circular platforms which were kind of ramped to prevent cattle getting into them and cut into the hillside steep on the upper side and banked on the lower side. Apart from that, there's not very much we can say until the archaeobotanical results come back. But they seem to have been kind of banked with this clay bank, and then they're otherwise just made out of the kind of generic material from the hillside, which in Gleann Leac-na-Muidhe is this very kind of iron-rich, red, kind of rough, broken up bedrock, essentially. So particularly unpleasant to dig through. So looking at that cluster then, and in relationship to the kind of features of the township, which, if we're to believe the sources, is this kind of chiefly upland summer dwelling. We have this kind of cluster of shieling activity. We've got two potential kind of peat stances as well. We've actually got areas of rig and furrow even within the shieling grounds. So we've got this kind of idea that people are managing this landscape in various different ways and responding to the conditions in the time, increased level of fertilisation, better weather conditions at various points perhaps, and thinking that this is being occupied during a time when the climate is actually changing quite drastically. We're kind of reaching the worst points of the Little Ice Age as well. So it's worth kind of considering how are people responding to these kind of events, which are happening during lifetimes even, worsening weather conditions and such. But we also have this kind of township site then, and there's some quite interesting kind of systems of dikes which seem to kind of delineate what is township and what is upland grazing, but also perhaps kind of manage the movement of cattle to those upland grazings through the township, which is quite an interesting thing to be able to kind of map as well. And so we've got this kind of system of probable loans as well as kind of controlling dikes and such, and areas of cultivation up in this upland area as well. So it's a really interesting site, and we're hoping to do further excavation of the township site this year. But just to kind of think then about how this landscape's being used, and this is obviously in its kind of occupied state, assuming some kind of contemporarity between those shieling structures as well. So imagine this is during the kind of 1600s. And just to try and kind of contextualize this into the kind of early modern uplands and the world that's existing when these places are being occupied. So we've got a kind of increasing period of insecurity, civil strife. You know, you've got the Cromwellian wars, the kind of glorious revolution at the very end, perhaps, and the kind of Williamite wars and religious wars happening during this time period. And even before that, you've got a kind of period of political change and uncertainty in which the kind of elites, the societal elites in this part of the world, are kind of increasingly trying to kind of stamp their control over the landscape through the kind of formalisation of estate centres and such. And lots of work's been done on that by Crystal Leash, looking at the Campbells of Glenorchy in particular, who are very relevant to thinking about Glencoe, because they are the direct neighbours of MacDonald's of Glencoe, essentially, having this kind of broad sway from Belgarden right the way through to Loch Tay. These being very much the Dukes of Brealvin after a certain point. And so it's quite interesting to think about the relationships that are going on here politically that are kind of creating the situation that we have in the Glencoe uplands. And so for much of the kind of earlier part of the 1600s, the MacDonalds of Glencoe have essentially signed an agreement of protection with the Campbells of Glenorchy. And so what this essentially means is that the MacDonalds are the hired heavies, or the people who will do the dirty work of the Campbells in this period. And so the MacDonalds are very, very explicitly mentioned as being kind of behind very much the clearance of the MacGregors out of Ranagh and their grazings on Ranagh. They're also involved in various kind of dirty deeds that go on in order to kind of secure the power of Campbell of Glenorchy over his kind of extended realm in this period. And this is kind of a quite interesting story, because we see in the Privy Council records at various points that MacDonald of Glencoe is being brought up and supposed to appear in court for various crimes, which has been kind of complained about by various neighbours. And then time and time again, the Campbell of Glenorchy is actually paying the amount that's due for him not to appear before the Privy Council. So there's some quite interesting kind of relations going on there. And suddenly these are kind of altered when it comes to those religious wars in the latter part of the 1600s. MacDonalds fall on the side, obviously, of the kind of Jacobite restoration, and the Campbells are very firmly on the side of the Williamites. And so we have this quite interesting situation where that allegiance suddenly switches, and the kind of power relations within this region also become a little bit less sure. And so the MacDonalds then suddenly are within a generation, are aligning themselves with the Stuarts of Appin and MacDonalds of Keppoch. The Stuarts of Appin actually having been their traditional enemies for quite a while, as a result of various kind of activities that had gone on, and being potentially the murderer of MacDonald's own father, the chief of the MacDonalds. And so we have quite an interesting situation going on here. And we can see in this image from Crystal Leash's article that actually there's this network of castles being constructed across this region at this time, which is supposed to kind of control these upland areas and these kind of estate networks that are stretching across the region. And so what's happening in Glencoe at this time is potentially quite kind of similar on a smaller scale. MacDonald of Glencoe not being a kind of group of many resources. And so with this kind of picture of the unease that's going on across the region then, we've perhaps got this idea that the Shielings themselves, and maybe a kind of expansion of those upland Shielings, is being done as a very deliberate act to kind of reinforce control over these kind of intermediary zones, these kind of boundaries between estate grounds, which are so often based on the kind of watersheds and the hill ridges. And so perfect places really at those kind of meeting points to place Shielings as well. And actually there's a part of this kind of seasonal busyness that's an intentional part of these landscapes. It's been intentionally managing and monitoring and protecting and reinforcing these kind of boundaries between grounds, and kind of ensuring that your neighbours' tenants aren't starting to stray onto your grazings or vice versa. There's a kind of policing of this through the Shieling system and through the presence of these kind of chiefly dwellings within the uplands. And they can be seen in various other kind of contexts as well. Mar Lodge has some wonderful examples where we see these kind of what are presumably kind of Shieling grounds, which are eventually converted into kind of hunting camps by the kind of later 1600s, early 1700s, which are being used at these very much the boundaries of the estates, those kind of corners of the uplands, in order to kind of reinforce the power of the Earls of Mar upon their domain as well. And so a similar picture is kind of emerging, I think, across most of the kind of central and eastern Highlands as well, which is really interesting to kind of bear in mind when thinking about this. This is the other feature. So this is that larger Shieling hut that we excavated as well. So it measures about 11 metres across. And it seems to have many phases. It's quite a complex structure, actually. It's quite substantial, quite thick dry stone walls as well, which is curious in an area where most of the Shielings were actually turf built. And it seems like they are the kind of original walls that are just maintained over time as well. So in the earliest phases, I have very little doubt that it's not a kind of large Shieling hut. It's potentially one of the kind of largest huts that in an Irish context might be called a billy hut. And they're kind of associated with either being the kind of social heart of the Shieling cluster, the kind of party hut or ceilidh hut, as we might kind of consider in a Scottish context then. But they're also sometimes considered to be as well these kind of residences for essentially the kind of milkmaids of a landlord or a lord or a laird, who isn't themselves sending their family up to the Shieldings, and so they have a kind of hired group of milkmaids who are taking on that responsibility to look after a larger herd that belongs to the kind of elite of that area, who isn't themselves sending up their family. And so potentially we've got some quite interesting kind of social dynamics occurring within this structure as well, if we take that interpretation, which has been posited a few times now. But what's really interesting about this structure actually is its reuse. So there seems to have been a kind of phase of abandonment after its initial use as a shieling, after which it kind of gets reconstructed again, but in a quite different form, and it's being used for a quite different activity, we think, as well. So it's probably converted into, at some point, a whisky bothy. And we can evidence this pretty well by the fact that it has 3 hearths on the same floor layer, which, even within a structure 11 metres across, is far too many hearths, really, if you think about having a cosy night in. So it has one in the kind of top left-hand corner, which is kind of within a kind of stone basket sitting in one corner. So potentially designed so that you could kind of set a vessel on top of that basket of stone and thus kind of heat that. We've got a central hearth that's a good bit larger, so potentially for kind of a larger surface on which to heat something. It's been suggested that's kind of a malting floor, potentially, if you're producing kind of smaller portions of quantities of grain. And then in the far corner, there's this kind of stone-built structure built into the corner, which is interpreted as a kind of cupboard-like feature. But within that as well, there was also a hearth sitting on top of a slab floor. And within that hearth, we found a strip of copper alloy, which appears to be a kind of flattened out pipe piece. So that seems pretty certain to have been perhaps a stillworm, and it's quite similar to examples that have been excavated before. Running, not visualised in this plan, unfortunately, but running just to the kind of bottom of this image here, there's actually a kind of canalised burn as well, which has been deliberately reshaped to run around and down the back wall of this structure and then around. So again, quite classic for a whisky bothy, this kind of manipulation of the water source to provide that kind of constant water source that you need for that. And quite interestingly, when it was excavated, not only was there quite a large portion of pottery came out of it, which again, mostly drinking vessels by the looks of them. There was also some kind of onion bulb bottle glass as well, and 6 pieces of pistol shot as well, which is quite an interesting find in terms of thinking about how the structure's been used. And they were found buried underneath one of the slabs that makes up the kind of entrance threshold. So potentially a kind of deliberate stashing of munitions. And if we think about quite a lot of the literature that relates to kind of contemporary accounts of gaugers and their conflicts with the illicit stillers, there are quite a lot of accounts of kind of pistol fights going on, including one quite humorous one from Tayside, where a gauger somehow manages to shoot himself in the crotch with a pistol. So there's some quite interesting things going on in this landscape, actually, that we can tell stories that go beyond just kind of the Shielings, but actually we can start to kind of set out chronologies of what's going on within this landscape too. So by the time that this is a whisky bothy, it's probably around about the time of the conversion of the site to a sheep farm as well, because that's around about the time that the kind of malting and the distilling laws come in as well. And so actually, Glencoe is one of those rather interesting and perhaps for some people slightly uncomfortable examples of where essentially the clearance and the kind of improvement of the landscape into sheep farms happened fairly early and was carried out by the traditional lords of that estate as well. So it's reckoned that the sheep farm started to be kind of constructed in Glencoe from around about 1790, which is slightly on the earlier scale for the sheep farming. And that they seem to have been kind of championed largely by MacDonald of Glencoe and MacDonald of Achnacawn and Nabethan as well. And so we've got quite an interesting kind of picture coming out of this, in which there's a sudden kind of change in what activities are being carried out within this landscape, but also how it's kind of being managed as well. And the kind of tenancy of these farms and such is quite an interesting topic for discussion as well. But to think then about a chronology of this landscape then, so we go from a kind of pre-1690s potentially image, where we've got the Shieling grounds, we've got the sort of chiefly hunting settlements, we've got the charcoal burning platforms and the peat cuttings as well. After that kind of disruptive event that is the massacre, and if we think about it, quite a considerable portion of the Glencoe population it ceases to be within this landscape at that time through either having been massacred or fleeing the area and not returning. And we get this kind of change in how the landscape's being used, and there's quite a few of the settlements within the main glen as well are abandoned during this sort of break as well, and we see that through the difference between Ponce maps and Roy's maps. But we also see here that the kind of Shieling ground seems to still continue, and we know that still continues because we have records in Tobran Dillish that talk about people whose ancestors had gone to the Shielings within kind of recent generations. So we know that it's still occurring after the 1600s at least. So we still have the Shieling grounds. We've potentially still got the charcoal burning platforms and peat cuttings as well. And we know that peat's still the kind of dominant fuel here, and this is really the only source of decent peat cuttings on this side of the pass of Glencoe, and it seems unlikely that everyone is having to rely on going all the way to Rannoch to cut their peats. But by 1795, we've got this kind of conversion then. So we have the Hill Sheep Farm, and we have associated with it probably this whisky bothy as well. And so a quite kind of radical shift in how this landscape's being used and managed as well is going on in this time period. And so I think what kind of comes from the study of Glencoe really is the question of Rannoch becomes quite curious. And I really have no answers to this part, except a burning curiosity to know. I'm sure you're all aware Rannoch has never actually been properly surveyed, largely because I don't think the Royal Commission could drive a Land Rover across it. It's quite miserable during the sunny months with midges, and it's quite miserable in the rainy months with rain and snow and cold. And as someone who tried to survey it once, fell in a bog up to their chest and had to get pulled out with a rope, it's quite an unpleasant place to be at various times in the year. But actually, I think it's really critical to understanding what's going on in this whole region. We know, for instance, that people, the kind of shieling grounds and communities as far away as Loch Tay had shieling grounds on Rannoch as well, all the way across the kind of the fringes of Loch Rannoch. But as far away as well as Appin and Glencoe as well, everyone in the surrounding area seems to be having their grazings or their kind of far away grazings on Rannoch. And so there's a really interesting question of what is in Rannoch actually, because there's so little survey work being done. We really only have an airplane crash from the war, a line of military way milestones, and a few of the kind of unroofed structures from the first edition survey. So that there really is very little that we actually know about this vast, expansive landscape that would be really important, I think, for our understanding of what's going on within this kind of centre of Scotland in this time period. And just to kind of highlight that, you can see there Glencoe, we've got Dalness, we've got Altadder, so that's that castle of the Campbells of Glenorchy as well. And then on the far side, we've got kind of Forest of Rannoch and Glen Lyon as well, are all fringing this landscape. And so it's very obviously a kind of very important part of our understanding of how these kind of uplands are being managed in this time period, but also the relationship between these different groups and how that relationship maybe changes over time as well. So I'm really, really excited to hopefully do some work there in future as well. And I'll just kind of summarise then with a little bit of what we're going to be doing going forward then. So my PhD research focused on those excavations of the Shielings and the whisky bothy. But going forward, we're hoping this summer we'll be back and we're going to excavate the township site in Gleann Leac-na-Muidhe. So we're going to try and investigate, is this actually a cheaply kind of hunting settlement, seasonal settlement? What sort of activities are going on within this landscape? How is that? What is the kind of chronology of those structures? And how is it being managed over time as well? So that's our kind of main focus for the excavation. We're also going to carry out a survey of those kind of royal hunting grounds. So particularly the two larrigs, which are the kind of passes between Dalness and Glencoe proper. And hopefully then we'll be able to kind of compare and contrast the archaeology of this kind of hunting forest to the kind of managed uplands to see how exactly these are kind of being used, if these are being used in different ways, if they're being used in similar ways. Hopefully we'll be able to start to kind of answer questions along those lines. And moving forward, we're hoping to carry out and kind of shift our focus towards Rannoch so that we're getting a more comprehensive picture of the kind of Glencoe and environs, and particularly those kind of fringes of Rannoch in that direction, and how they are being managed and understood in that kind of post-medieval period. So just a brief bibliography and to thank my various supervisors, the National Trust for Scotland, who have been the most magnificent help during all this in providing accommodation, funding and such as well, and support and logistics and such. And to thank the excavators and surveyors who put up with me standing over them and asking them to dig faster. So just to end there then, I'd love to hear what you thought about that. Any questions you have would be fantastic as well. Thank you very much for listening.